Our next reader is Molly Beach Murphy. She's an NYC-based playwright and director from Galveston, Texas. Her plays include Molly Murphy and Neil deGrasse Tyson on Our Last Day on Earth, Big Ben in the Red Dirt Desert, the H2O Pool Bar at the San Luis Hotel. Three-time artistic resident at the Incubator Arts Project, New Georgia's affiliated artist, member of French Ground Peppers Playground Playgroup. She's published works in the Hairpen and the Santa Ana River Review. Please welcome Molly Beach Murphy. Hi, I'm Molly. It's only an estimate, but I've done the math. My father died while I was in a rundown hotel lobby in Newburgh, New York, picking up my race number for a half marathon that would begin in just under an hour. Dad, at 62, was still an impressively healthy athlete. He swam a mile a day. Whew. He rode his bike twice daily, and he played volleyball every weekend. One of the biggest regrets of his life was that he could not persuade me to take an interest in the game, despite the fact that I, quote, had the shoulders for it. That Saturday morning, 2 Junes ago, while I was driving north from New York City to Newburgh, he went out riding along the marshes in our hometown of Galveston, Texas. The woman who lives in the old Victorian house along the secluded road saw Dad standing next to his bike just before 7 a.m., kickstand down, staring out into the marsh. A few minutes after 7, a kayaker was driving toward the boat ramp just beyond the old Victorian house, where he saw Dad laid out in the street beside his upright bike. He'd suffered a massive heart attack, and we were told he might have been dead before he hit the ground. While the EMTs tried to resuscitate him in the street, I was going about my premeditative race rituals. I was applying sunscreen, the ever-important chafing stick, organizing my gel packs and water bottles. I sat in a parking lot, and I wrote a race blessing on the tops of my feet in Sharpie, an Edmund Hillary quote I use for all long races. It's not the mountain we conquer, but ourselves. Dad was in transport to the hospital when I lined up with the other runners. We complained about the heat. The race was supposed to start 15 minutes ago. Who's in charge here? After more grumbling, the air horn sounded and we inched forward. My father was pronounced dead, painfully close to the moment I crossed the starting line, and then I ran for 2.5 hours. As I ran in New York, phone calls shot around town in Texas. A cousin on the police force heard the radio and thought, that sounds like Joe Murphy. The woman who lives in the old Victorian house called her friend Mona, who called a friend who's married to a woman who knew my dad. Was it really Joe Murphy? Who knows his wife? I watched boats sail up the Hudson River. I noted several dream homes. I was annoyed at the lack of water stations along the route. An hour into the race, I took a walk break and I called my mom just for a few minutes of distraction. We chatted cheerfully for a bit until she said, "This is a race. You have to run." I obeyed. Less than 2 minutes after our phone call ended, police showed up at my mother's door and I kept running. The young police officers didn't tell her that Dad was dead. They can't legally. They said he'd been found and that Mom would need to go to the hospital immediately and they would be happy to give her a ride. My mother, forever a cool customer, drove herself. As I ran through the Hudson Valley, my right hip started to ache and I became increasingly worried about sunburn. There was no cloud cover or shade and the sun was brutal. When I started to overheat, I poured water over my head, which filled my eyes with sunscreen. I was in the 10th mile when my mother identified my dad's body. In the 12th mile, I bottomed out. The heat, the badly paved roads, the hills, my fucking hip, the unbearable sun, the stupid dream homes. I was cooked. I thought about calling my mom, but my battery was almost toast and I needed the GPS to track the race. It was at this point that I heard a male voice yell from behind me, "Hey you, run! What are you doing? This is the 12th mile and you're walking? Go!" I turned and a wiry middle-aged man was yelling at me, "Just fake it, run, run, you run with me." I'm a feminist, but I've also always been very responsive to strict authoritative males, so I ran. We ran the entire rest of the race. I ran side by side with this stranger, our feet in perfect sync. We didn't speak a word at all the way to the finish line. Once we crossed, I thanked him. He told me his name was Victor. I'd never met a Victor, and we parted ways. In Texas, a plane ticket had just been bought on my behalf to leave LaGuardia at 6 that evening. I met up with my friends and we triumphantly brunched. I pulled out my phone and it was dead, but we ate a beautifully extravagant meal: beer, sausage, cheese fries. Our bodies were trashed. Every ache and grimace was a trophy. At this point, my mother had been trying to reach me for 2 hours. Finally, in an unbelievable moment of clarity, she realized that in the cell phone she never uses, she had the number of one of my racing friends. Just as we were paying for our meal and I was promising myself not to worry about the cost until tomorrow, my friend's phone rang. My mother's name on the caller ID. I answered, and then came the simplest string of words and the most life-altering sentence I've ever heard. "Molly, your father died this morning." The rest of the day is a hysterical blur, racing back to Manhattan, stopping at my apartment for 15 minutes so I could shower while my friends threw clothes in a bag. At LaGuardia, a ticketing problem arose. A middle-aged gate agent took me under his wing. He changed my flight immediately, gave me a business class ticket, gate passes so my friends could wait with me at the gate, as well as 5 drink tickets so I could make some friends on the plane. Just before I dashed off to security, he took my bag and he hugged me goodbye and told me his name, which was Victor. By the time I sat in the family room in Texas, I'd been up almost 24 hours. How did I wake up in New York to run a race and end up in Galveston without a dad? How was I carried along by possibly the only 2 Victors I'd ever met in my life? If it were a dream, it would mean something. If it were a dream, the Victors would be some sort of lesson. But the next day and all the days after that would only continue the whirlwind that began in the marsh that June morning. I longed for that race, the one I hated running, with the bad roads and the heat and the sun and the cars and the not enough water stations. Those seemingly miserable 2.5 hours before the world ended, before I ever met anyone named Victor. The road when the journey was still linear, when I could put one foot in front of the other and be assured that I was still moving forward. Thank you.